You were lying in a wooden bed, surrounded by the low creaking of timbers and the distant clang of a church bell. Outside, the air is still. There are no voices on the street. The baker has not opened his shutters. The priest passed by yesterday and has not returned. It is the year 1348, and the plague is here. The bubonic plague, known most infamously as the Black Death, was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, it is estimated to have killed between 30% to 60% of Europe's population. But behind those staggering statistics lies a slower, quieter reality. A reality lived by people, not just numbers. What was it like to be alive during those years? To wake up each day not knowing whether your family would survive the week. To go to sleep to the sound of coughing or silence and wonder which was worse. In this video, we're not going to dramatize the horror or turn suffering into spectacle. We are simply going to look at the facts and the feelings of daily life during the plague years. We will take our time walking through the world as it was, examining how people lived, what they believed, what they feared, and how remarkably life still continued in the midst of death. Setting the stage, Europe before the plague. Before we understand the impact of the plague, we need to understand the world it entered. Europe in the early 14th century was a continent of contrasts. The High Middle Ages had brought population, growth, expanding trade routes, and the flowering of cities. Towns were bustling with artisans, merchants, priests, and beggars. Fields across France, England, and the Germanic states were dotted with villages where peasants worked the land, bound to local lords, but living lives rooted in rhythm and tradition. It was not a golden age, but it was a world in motion. There were hardships, famines, wars, and superstition, but there was also a sense of continuity. People lived close to the seasons, the church bells, the land. The village was the center of life. Travel was rare for most. News traveled slowly, and the mysteries of illness and death were met not with scientific understanding, but with prayer and fear. Then something new arrived. The arrival of the plague in October of 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. They carried goods, men, and something invisible, disease. Within days, dock workers fell ill. Within weeks, the city was overwhelmed as the ships continued along trade routes through Italy, France, Spain, and beyond. So did the plague. But the people of Europe did not know this. They didn't understand how disease spread. Germ theory was still centuries away. Instead, they relied on what they could see and what they had been taught, that illness was punishment for sin, or caused by bad air, or the result of a celestial imbalance. That, as the disease moved inland, slowly and inevitably, people began to die, first in ones and twos, then in dozens, then hundreds. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris, entire districts emptied. Bodies lay in the streets. Priests died administering last rites. Physicians gave up or fled, and the people left behind began to ask questions that had no comforting answers. The face of death. To understand what life was like, we have to first understand what the plague actually did. The bubonic plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily through fleas that lived on rats. But again, no one in 1348 knew this. All they saw were the symptoms, and those symptoms were terrifying. It often began with fever and chills. Then painful swellings appeared, buboes, hence the name bubonic, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. These lumps could swell to the size of an egg or an apple, turning black with internal bleeding, hence the term Black Death. Victims could also suffer vomiting, delirium, and a deathly pallor. Some would die within days, others within hours. There were other forms of the plague too. Pneumonic, which infected the lungs and spread through coughs, and septicemic, which turned the blood toxic and often killed before external symptoms appeared. For many, there was no hope of recovery. Mortality rates were between 50% and 90%, depending on the form of the disease. And in towns and villages where the plague struck, it didn't just take individuals, it shattered families, wiped out entire households, and silenced streets. Daily life amidst the crisis. Despite the horror, life continued. It had 2 peasants still tilled the land, even if fewer came each day. Bakers still tried to sell bread, even if customers no longer lined up. Monks still chanted their prayers, even as their brothers disappeared from the choir stalls. For many, the greatest challenge was not illness, but isolation. As fear grew, communities broke down. Infected houses were sealed or abandoned. Families refused to care for one another. Father abandoned child, wife, husband, wrote one chronicler. Brother turned from brother. And yet others stayed, some out of love, some out of duty, and some because they had nowhere else to go. Doctors and barber surgeons, though largely powerless, continued to tend the sick. Priests gave last rites until they too succumbed. Grave diggers, often the lowest in society, became essential, digging mass pits to contain the growing dead dot. In cities, the smell of death was constant. Streets reeked of rot, incense, and lime. Bells tolled endlessly. In rural areas, entire villages went quiet. Fields lay fallow and roads became overgrown, and yet the world did not stop. Not entirely. Some markets stayed open. Some towns enforced quarantines. In Venice, a 40-day isolation period, 40 giorni, was introduced for ships, giving us the term quarantine. But most people simply tried to carry on, to survive, to wait and hope. Misunderstanding and blame with no clear cause, people looked for scapegoats. Astrologers blamed planetary alignment. Clergy preached about God's wrath. Physicians pointed to miasmas, bad air, or imbalanced humors in the body. In many places, Jews were accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the plague. Though these accusations were baseless, thousands were killed in pogroms across Europe. Fear bred cruelty, suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor. Flagellants, groups of extreme penitents, wandered from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for sin. They believed that if enough people showed remorse, God would lift his punishment. But the plague did not lift. Not yet. Faith, fear, and meaning for most people. Religion was not a choice. It was the lens through which all life was understood. So when the plague struck, many turned to the church. Some found comfort, others found confusion. Why had God allowed this? Why were the innocent dying? church leaders offered prayers, processions, and penance. But as priests died and churches closed, trust began to fray. Some saw the plague as the beginning of the end times. Others saw it as proof that society had become corrupt. But even amid despair, daily devotions continued. Candles were lit, psalms were chanted, and in quiet corners of Europe, some communities pulled together, caring for the sick, sharing what little they had, and praying not just for survival, but for meaning. Not just rats today, we often imagine the Black Death as a singular moment. Rats, fleas, plague doctors, and piles of bodies. But in reality, it was a slow, rolling disaster, one that unfolded differently from place to place. In some towns, the plague came and went in weeks. In others, it lingered for months, returning again in later waves. Some regions were devastated. Others were barely touched, and even amid loss, people adapted. They adjusted burial practices. They rewrote wills. They married quickly, fearing death. They recorded what they saw in chronicles and letters. They hoped for relief, and eventually relief came. By 1351, the first great wave of the plague had subsided. But Europe was not the same. The bells have stopped ringing. The streets are quiet. And though the air is still heavy with memory, the worst has passed. You rise from your bed, not knowing what tomorrow brings, only that you have survived. Chapter 3: The Dead and the Living. Death's daily companion in the plague years, the streets are quiet, but not empty. A cart rolls slowly by, pulled by a single ox. On it, a mound of cloths-covered forms, some still shaped like people, some already collapsed in on themselves. The driver does not ring a bell. He no longer needs to. The people know what the cart means. In this chapter, we turn to death, not as a moment of ending, but as a condition of life. During the plague years, death was not rare nor private. It was visible, constant, and it reshaped how people lived and how they mourned. For many, the question was no longer if someone would die, but when, how, and where they would be buried, if at all. But even in the face of mass mortality, the human need to honor the dead remained. And while customs broke down and rituals changed, the boundary between the living and the dead grew not thinner, but more carefully watched. Death at scale: historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa during the plague's worst years. In Europe alone, between 1/3 and 2/3 of the population perished. These are staggering numbers, but they don't capture the daily reality. Entire villages lost every inhabitant. Families disappeared from records in a single month. Some towns stopped keeping records altogether. The scale was not just demographic. It was emotional, spiritual, and physical. No society is built to bury that many people at once. Traditional practices buckled under the pressure. Cemeteries overflowed, churches struggled to keep up with funerals, and the living had to make choices to honor the dead or to survive another day. The good death before the plague. Death in Christian Europe was a well-lauded ritual. People died at home, surrounded by family. They received last rites. From a priest, confession, absolution, the Eucharist, and prayers were offered. After death, the body was washed, dressed, and laid out. Neighbors came to pay respects. Bells rang, funeral masses were held. The dead were buried in consecrated ground, close to churches if possible. This was known as ars moriendi, the art of dying well. A good death was not about comfort, but about preparation. The soul made ready to meet God with help from the living. But during the plague, this ideal became almost impossible to maintain. The breakdown of ritual as the number of dead rose, funeral customs began to collapse. Priests, overwhelmed or already dead themselves, could not visit every dying person. Many went unshriven, unable to confess their sins before death. Some feared that God would not forgive those who died unblessed. Others believed the plague itself was proof of damnation. Bodies piled up in homes, streets, and churches. In cities like Avignon and Florence, the dead were stacked in carts and moved to mass graves, trenches dug hurriedly. Sometimes several bodies deep, survivors buried loved ones as best they could. A cloth over the face, a prayer whispered over a grave that would never be marked, but increasingly there was no time and no one left to mourn. Mass graves and new practices. The most visible sign of the plague's toll was the rise of mass graves, often called plague pits. These were large trenches dug outside city walls or in open fields. Some were ordered by city governments, others were simply dug by survivors, desperate to remove the smell and danger of rotting bodies. In London, the Aldergate and East Smithfield pits held thousands. In Venice and Paris, special plague cemeteries were created, isolated from the population. Bodies were often buried without coffins, sometimes without clothing. Quicklime was poured over the remains to accelerate decomposition. Crosses were left if wood and labor were available. But many sites were unmarked, and yet, even here, we see moments of reverence. Some pits were blessed by clergy. Songs were sung. In some cases, flowers were scattered. In others, families waited until nightfall to say private farewells. The dead may have been many, but they were not all forgotten. The job no one wanted, handling the dead, became a grim necessity and an occupation. In cities, special workers were hired or conscripted to collect bodies, known as corpse bearers, death cart men, or simply the collectors. They moved from door to door, often with bells or cries of warning. They were paid poorly and treated with suspicion, but they were essential. Some wore protective garments soaked in vinegar or aromatic herbs. Others carried long poles to avoid touching the dead directly. Still, most became ill eventually. Their work was both feared and resented, and yet it was the only thing keeping the living from being swallowed by the dead. The role of the church remained a central figure in death, but its role was challenged as never before. Monasteries, once places of calm and prayer, became overwhelmed with corpses. Monks and nuns died in vast numbers. In some places, entire religious communities vanished. Churchyards became graveyards. The bells of lauds and vespers were replaced by the constant tolling of death. Priests gave last rites by shouting through windows. Some performed mass burials without even knowing the names of the dead, and yet the church adapted. New prayers were written. Masses for the plague dead became common. Memorials were held months later. When the living could finally gather, the faith of the people was shaken, but not lost. Grief in a time of plague grief is shaped by culture and by time. In the 14th century, people grieved through ritual, funerals, prayers, masses, mourning garments, candles, but the plague disrupted all of it. Many lost not one person, but many parents, children, spouses, neighbors, all within weeks. The grief was not just personal, it was collective, communal, and disorienting. How do you mourn when everyone is mourning? How do you process loss when it comes too fast to understand? Some became numb, some collapsed in despair, others turned to extreme piety or extreme pleasure. The shock of death made life feel urgent, raw, and uncertain. But across Europe, we see evidence of memory. Names carved into church walls, psalters and books of hours with added memorial prayers. Notes left in parish rolls. Even amid chaos, people tried to remember. The legal legacy of death also changed law and inheritance. With so many dying so quickly, wills were written in haste. Legal disputes erupted over land, property, and titles. Children became orphans. Widows became landowners. Estates were abandoned, seized, or contested. Entire lines of inheritance vanished. In some regions, women gained unusual freedom, able to control property or remarry by necessity. In others, chaos ruled. Squatters took over manors, peasants fled obligations, and feudal lords struggled to enforce their rights. The dead no longer ruled from the grave. In many cases, the living were too few or too tired to care. The physical presence of the dead in cities, the dead left a visible mark, empty homes, boarded doors, streets where grass grew, the smell of lime and incense in the air. Cemeteries expanded, bones rose to the surface. In some places, charnel houses were built, buildings to hold bones once graves were full. Skulls were stacked, femurs aligned. Death became part of the urban landscape, and in art the dead returned. Wall paintings showed Dong's macabre skeletons dancing with the living, reminding all that death came for rich and poor alike. Manuscripts featured images of decay and skeletons. This was not morbid fascination. It was cultural memory, a way to keep the dead present in the mind. The living in the shadow of death, for those who survived, life after the plague felt different. Time felt different. There was guilt. Why did I live? There was fear, will. It returned. There was purpose. What do I do now? Some became more pious, others more cynical. Many simply became quiet. They continued on planting gardens, repairing walls, teaching children, because life had to continue. But the dead walked with them, in memory, in dream, in silence. The plague took the bodies, but not the humanity. In fields where mass graves were dug, wildflowers grew. In cities where the dead had filled the streets, bells rang again. And though much was lost, something survived, the determination to live, even in the shadow of death. Chapter 4. Daily life continued, surviving the everyday in a dying world. Approximately 2,000 words. Immersive, somber tone. The sun still rises. Even when the bells toll all morning, even when the streets are quiet and the air carries the scent of sickness. The sun rises, and so people wake, some to pray, some to sweep their doorstep, some to cry, most simply to live. While much has been said of the dead, and rightly so, this chapter turns its gaze toward the living. How did they endure? Because endure they did. They baked bread, they mended clothing, they walked to market. They tried to keep their children clean, they whispered gossip. They looked to the sky and wondered if it would rain. Even as the world shifted around them, the smallest acts of daily life continued. And in those acts, those quiet repetitions, we find both a stubbornness and a kind of faith that life could still be lived, even in a world cracking under death. Daily chores in a plague, year work never stopped, though it changed shape. Women still rose early to tend fires and prepare porridge. Men checked fences, gathered tools, and examined animals for signs of illness, not just human illness, but livestock disease, which often accompanied plagues. Children fetched water from wells, careful not to linger. Laundry was still done, though more cautiously. Lye and vinegar were prized not only for cleaning, but for their supposed ability to ward off contagion. In cities, domestic servants thinned as households shrank or shut their doors. Tasks once divided among many now fell to the few who remained. And yet the rhythms held. Sweep the floor, stir the pot, shake out the sheets. These small routines became anchors. In the face of unpredictability, repetition was survival. Food, famine, and the fragility of supply even. The most basic human need, food, became a matter of uncertainty. Markets shrank. Merchants fled cities or died en route. Local harvests failed not from poor weather, but from a lack of labor, to few hands to sow, reap, mill, or transport. And with famine came fear. Bread, the cornerstone of the medieval diet, became precious. Rye, barley, oats, and wheat were stored, hoarded, stolen. Porridge thickened with beans or roots became the meal of many. Meat, already scarce, nearly vanished for the poor. Those who could afford it turned to preserved foods. Salted fish, hard cheese, onions, garlic. Some began to fear fresh produce, associating it with spoiled air or bad humors. Wine, vinegar, and ale became more than luxuries. They were believed to purify and protect. Starvation didn't kill as many as the plague, but it loomed behind every closed granary gate. Remedies, rituals, and everyday medicine. World with few answers. People created their own logic. They hung herbs in doorways, rosemary, rue, lavender, and wormwood. They chewed angelica root, washed with rose water, drank vinegar mixed with crushed pearls, or burned resinous wood. These weren't mere superstition. They were attempts at control, at cleanliness, at care. Households mixed their own salves, poultices and tonics. Recipes passed through whispers and scrawled notes. Onion compresses, leech treatments, ground emerald in wine. The line between healing and hope blurred. Prayer, too, was a kind of medicine. Rosaries wore smooth with use. Saints were petitioned, holy relics were pressed to foreheads. And still people died, but they died having tried. And for those left behind, that mattered. Work, guilds, and the economy of the sick-for tradesmen and artisans. The plague was both a curse and, strangely, a chance. With so many dead, wages rose. Demand for labor spiked. A mason, a carpenter, a blacksmith. Suddenly these skills commanded respect and coins. For some, it was the first time they had real bargaining power. Guilds struggled to maintain ranks. Apprentices rose quickly. Standards slipped in some places, strengthened in others. The economy bent, twisted, and in some cases broke. Women stepped into roles traditionally barred to them. They ran shops, oversaw fields, made contracts, not because society allowed it, but because society had no choice. In death's wake, rules became negotiable. Clothing the plague, year's dress, became both function and fear. The wealthy added layers, not for warmth, but for perceived protection. Gloves, hoods, veils, thick cloaks soaked in perfumes. In cities, the air stank of camphor and rose oil. The poor had fewer options. Rags, patched tunics, old cloaks. What couldn't be washed was aired out. What couldn't be aired was burned. Clothing also became a signal. Those marked as sick or suspected were sometimes made to wear special garments or signs. Red crosses, white rags. Some cities mandated visible symbols. Others trusted rumor and fear to do the work. Even fashion adjusted. Simplicity returned. Not from modesty, but mourning. Love, touch, and isolation. What does it mean to love in a time of infection? Many died alone. Lovers kept their distance. Parents, afraid, hesitated to cradle fevered children. Priests gave absolution from yards away. Touch became a risk, and with it, affection changed. Still, people loved. Quietly, carefully, a glance, a prayer, a shared crust of bread. Some married in haste, either from desperation or defiance. Others remained celibate, believing that passion could provoke divine wrath, and still others lived boldly, hosting feasts, taking lovers, dancing while they could. For some, love became a kind of rebellion. The sound of faith church bells tolled constantly. For death, for mass, for comfort, many services were held outdoors. Open-air sermons, processions with relics, pilgrimages, though discouraged, increased. People walked barefoot, weeping, singing hymns. Others stayed home, lighting candles at dawn. Faith changed tone. Less triumph, more humility. Some became flagellants, groups who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in repentance. Others abandoned the church entirely, seeing its failure to protect. But belief did not vanish. It adapted. God was still present, even if his silence was louder than ever. The children survived, not all, but many, and those who did remember their childhood, not in years, but in seasons of fear. They played with fewer toys. They memorized new prayers. Some buried their parents. Others were taken in by relatives or monasteries. But children still played. They chased chickens. They splashed in streams. They whispered secrets behind garden walls, because they were children, and even in plague, childhood insists on itself. Their memories, written down years later, gave us some of our clearest views into how daily life stumbled on. Community and the changing shape of trust neighborhoods mattered until they died in single quotes. In small villages, everyone knew who was ill. In cities, rumors filled the void. Who had the sickness, who had fled, who had hidden a corpse to avoid quarantine. Trust frayed. Some communities turned inward, forming tighter bonds. Others fell apart. Neighbor turning on neighbor. Charity changed. 2. With fewer clergy and nobles, Mutual aid became vital. Food left at doorsteps, orphans fed by strangers. Healing shared by midwives and mothers, not doctors, even amid suspicion. Kindness appeared small, flickering acts that kept despair from taking root entirely. The new silences, the worst waves passed. A strange quiet settled over much. Of Europe. Fields lay fallow, villages emptied. Paths once busy with carts and travelers grew over with weeds. The noise of commerce gave way to birdsong and distant bells. And yet, behind doors and gates, life resumed. A baker lit his oven. A child practiced reading aloud. A widow planted onions near her stoop. It was not triumph, it was not joy, it was persistence. And then, no one emerged unchanged. The survivors were not the same people who had laughed at May Day festivals, who had walked to market with coins in their pockets and songs in their throats. Something had shifted inside and out, but they endured, they rebuilt, they married, they fought. They learned to live again, not despite the plague, but because of it. The sun rises, and someone stirs flour with water. Someone braids their child's hair, someone whispers a prayer. Someone sings just softly enough that the silence bends around it. The world has changed, but it is not gone. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Plague Doctors. Masks, myths, and medicine. In the midst of death's shadow, there appeared a figure both feared and mysterious. The Plague Doctor, cloaked, masked, carrying the scent of herbs and smoke, he moved like a spectre. Between the sick and the dying, the Plague Doctor is one of the most haunting images of the Black Death. That long-beaked mask, the heavy robes, the wooden cane, the wide-brimmed hat. But who were these figures really? What did they do? Were they healers, charlatans, or something in between? The origins of the Plague Doctor, the idea of a dedicated Plague Doctor, emerged as the Black Death ravaged Europe and cities struggled to contain its spread. The doctors were often hired by towns or cities to care for the sick and document the dead. Unlike regular physicians, who were few and far between, plague doctors were sometimes outsiders, hired more for their willingness to face danger than their skill. The costume we recognize today, the beaked mask stuffed with herbs, the heavy waxed robe, dates mainly from the 17th century, long after the initial wave of the Black Death in the mid-1300s. But the role had existed earlier. Doctors believed that the plague spread through miasma, bad, poisonous air. The mask's beak was filled with aromatic herbs and spices. Lavender, rosemary, mint, camphor, intended to filter and purify the air they breathed. The glass eye holes were meant to protect from infectious droplets. The long coat was waxed. For repellency, and gloves and boots were part of the ensemble to limit skin exposure. The medical theories behind the mask medieval medicine was rooted in humoral theory. The idea that health depended on balancing for bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease was thought to arise from imbalances and from exposure to corrupted air. Plague doctors carried tools, lancets for bloodletting, pomanders with perfumes, and herbs believed to have healing or protective powers. They would try bloodletting, cupping, or fumigations. The cane was not just a pointer, it was a tool for examining patients without direct touch and sometimes to ward off desperate or violent sufferers. Despite their grim work, many doctors had little understanding of the real cause: fleas on rats carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium. They worked with the knowledge they had, not the knowledge we now hold. Duties in the time of death. Plague doctors did not only treat the ill, they also kept records, noted symptoms, and reported deaths. Often, their job was administrative. As much as medical. In towns overwhelmed by sickness, they became a bridge between the living and the dead, the sick and the officials. They visited homes, sometimes forced entry, and decided who could be isolated or left to die. The work was dangerous. Many plague doctors themselves succumbed, but the pay, at times, was higher than usual. Danger brought its own premiums. The public perception, fear and fascination. The figure of the plague doctor was both feared and respected. Some saw them as healers, risking everything. Others saw them as omens of death, walking harbingers in eerie garb. Their strange costumes inspired fear and fascination, partly because of what the doctors represented: the presence of death, sickness, and the unknown. Stories circulated, sometimes exaggerated, about plague doctors' mysterious powers, their gruesome tasks, or their eerie detachment. The legacy of the plague doctor. Though the original plague doctors have long since passed, their image endures. From Halloween costumes to literature, they symbolize a time when humanity faced death on a scale unseen before. They remind us of the limits of knowledge, the persistence of hope, and the ways people try to protect themselves when facing the unknown. As the plague doctor's footsteps echo faintly down deserted streets, the herbs in his beak still scent the air, a quiet testimony to a desperate struggle, and the fragile thread of life hanging in the balance. Chapter 6: Flight and Fear. The Great Medieval Exodus, when the Black Death swept like a shadow over towns and villages. It sparked one of the greatest human migrations of the medieval world. Streets emptied, homes were abandoned, and entire communities fled in desperate hope of escape. The plague carried more than death, it carried fear. A fear so raw and contagious that it reshaped society overnight. For many, the only choice was flight. The decision to flee as news of the pestilence spread. Townspeople grappled with terror and uncertainty. Would staying mean certain death? Would fleeing mean safety or exile? For some, flight was immediate, the moment a neighbor fell ill. They gathered what belongings they could carry and fled, often on foot, towards countryside, forests, or any place perceived as safer. Families were torn apart in frantic escapes. Those too sick to travel were left behind. Abandoned homes and ghost towns, entire neighborhoods, emptied in days. Houses left unlocked, belongings scattered or left to rot. Markets stood silent. Shops shuttered, the usual hum of daily life vanished, replaced by a hollow stillness. Chroniclers wrote of villages deserted as if by magic, their fields untended, hearths cold. The journey, hardship on the roads became highways of desperation. Travelers faced hunger, exposure, and exhaustion. There was little infrastructure for such masses on the move. Many died along the way, too weak or stricken to continue. Those who reached rural villages were often met with suspicion. Strangers potentially carrying the plague. Villages and towns closed their gates. Communities sought to protect themselves by locking out outsiders. Walls were fortified, gates barred. Travelers and refugees were turned away or forced to quarantine outside town limits. At times, militia or guards enforced these bans with violence. The rise of the displaced and the homeless, those who fled, had nowhere to go, without homes or resources. Many became wandering beggars or bandits. Camps formed on the edges of towns or along roads. Disease and desperation intertwined. Family and social bonds stretched thin. Flight fractured communities and families. Loved ones were separated with little hope of reunion. Social trust eroded under suspicion and fear. Neighbors who once shared meals now eyed each other warily. Attempts to control movement, laws and punishments. Authorities tried to stem the exodus and control movement. Edicts forbade travel without permits. Penalties ranged from fines to imprisonment or worse. Despite these efforts, the fear of death often outweighed fear of punishment. Stories from the Exodus eyewitness accounts tell of desperate journeys, encounters with hostile villagers, and the heartache of leaving the sick behind. Some wrote of ghost trains, of refugees. Others described burned villages left behind by those fleeing. Long-term consequences of the Exodus, the Great Migration, reshaped demographics. Cities were depopulated, rural areas overwhelmed, labor shortages worsened. New social dynamics emerged as survivors and displaced peoples mixed the human face of flight. Beneath the statistics were countless individual stories of fear, courage, loss, and hope. Flight was not just survival, it was a tragic, wrenching choice made in the shadow of death. The roads remained scarred with footprints of those who fled, a silent testament to the desperate human will to live, even when the world seemed to crumble. Chapter 7: The Quarantine. Lockdowns in the 14th century, in the midst of a terrifying and invisible enemy. Medieval communities grasped for any means to halt the spread, and one of their most enduring answers was quarantine. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, cities and towns faced an impossible challenge: how to stop a disease no one fully understood, from consuming entire populations without modern medicine or germ theory. People relied on observation, tradition, and emerging rules born of desperation. Among these was the practice of quarantine, a word derived from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. The origins of quarantine did not appear overnight. The first known official quarantine measures emerged in the port city of Venice in 1377, decades after the first wave of the plague. But the concept was rooted in earlier practices. Venice, as a major trading hub, was acutely vulnerable. Officials decreed that arriving ships must anchor offshore for 40 days before passengers and goods could disembark. This time period was believed sufficient to ensure no latent disease remained. Quarantine in practice. Ports and shipports across the Mediterranean soon adopted similar rules. Ships carried pestilence across seas, so quarantining arrivals became a crucial defense. Ships were inspected and crews isolated in designated areas or lazarettos, early quarantine stations. Goods were fumigated or stored separately. This created logistical nightmares but saved countless lives. Household and city quarantine extended beyond ports. Entire households with sick members were isolated. Homes were marked to warn. Neighbors often avoided these houses. Fearing contamination, sometimes whole streets or districts were cordoned off. Officials enforced these lockdowns, sometimes with harsh penalties. Enforcement and resistance quarantine was not universally welcomed. It meant isolation, hunger, and economic hardship. People tried to evade or bribe officials. Guards patrolled gates and streets. Punishments included fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. The role of lazarettos and pest house communes established lazarettos, quarantine stations on islands or remote locations where suspected cases were kept. These places were grim but vital. They separated the sick from healthy populations. Medical care, such as it was provided here. Quarantines, social impacts, the measures changed daily life. Trade slowed. Social gatherings ceased. Fear of contagion led to mistrust. Yet quarantine was one of the earliest forms of organized public health. The legacy of medieval quarantine practices evolved and persisted. They laid groundwork for modern public health responses. The idea that isolation could slow disease spread was a crucial insight. As the gates closed and the streets emptied, the heavy silence of quarantine spoke volumes, a desperate, collective attempt to hold death at bay. Chapter 8. The animals knew first. Rats, cats, and medieval pest control long before the first human cough or fever. A silent procession of creatures threaded through medieval streets and homes. Rats scurried in shadows. Cats prowled quietly. The animals knew before the people, though no one truly understood what they carried. When the plague swept across Europe, it wasn't just humans who suffered. The animal world was entwined in the grim story, both as unwitting carriers and as scapegoats. The rodents of the plague today, we know that the Black Death's primary vector was the flea, which lived mostly on black rats. These rats were abundant in medieval cities, drawn to filth, garbage heaps, and the warmth of human dwellings. Fleas infected with the Yersinia pestis would bite rats, infecting them. When rats died, fleas sought new hosts, often humans. The cat's ambiguous role cats, long associated with both superstition and pest control, occupied a complicated place. On one hand, cats hunted rats and mice, potentially limiting the spread of fleas. On the other, cats themselves were suspected by many of being witches, familiars, or agents of evil. This led to mass killings of cats in some regions, ironically worsening the rat problem. The mass killing of animals, fear and folklore as plague fear escalated. Communities sought to kill animals believed to spread disease. Dogs and cats were slaughtered in waves of panic. This violent backlash reflected medieval misunderstanding of disease transmission, but also a desperate need to act. Dogs and other animals, dogs, often close companions, were similarly feared. Many were abandoned or killed. Horses and livestock were less implicated but suffered. Economic impacts as trade and agriculture declined. Animals as omens and symbols. Animals took on symbolic meanings. Black cats became emblems of bad luck. Birds, such as crows or ravens, were seen as harbingers of death. Stories abounded of strange animal behavior preceding human sickness. Medieval pest control efforts. Communities attempted rudimentary pest control. Poisons and traps were used to kill rats. Homes were fumigated with smoke and herbs. Despite efforts, lack of scientific knowledge, limited effectiveness. The legacy of animal associations in plague lore, intertwined fates of humans and animals during the plague-shaped folklore, superstition, and later scientific discovery. The story of rats and fleas eventually led to the modern understanding of plague transmission. As rats vanished from city streets and cats disappeared in fear, the medieval world learned harsh lessons about disease, about blame, and about the fragile balance between humans and the natural world. Chapter 9. The Body Collectors. Night work in a dying city. As the plague crept through cities, death multiplied beyond the capacity of families or churches to cope. Into the night stepped the body collectors, grim figures charged with the silent, sorrowful task of removing the dead. The Black Death overwhelmed medieval society in ways no one had ever imagined. With death rates soaring, ordinary burial customs broke down. The streets grew heavy with loss, and the living struggled to tend to the dead. The role of the body collectors, often poor men or prisoners hired or forced into service, had one task: to gather the dead, bring them to mass graves or plague pits, and keep the city moving. They worked mostly at night, when the living could avoid the ghastly scenes and the stench was less suffocating. Covered in coarse clothing, sometimes masks, these men carried out their grim duty under threat of contagion and social stigma. The nighttime harvest by night. The body collectors moved silently through narrow alleys and abandoned homes, their carts rickety and stained piled high with bodies. They heard the moans of the dying and the cries of those left behind. Some bodies were barely warm. Others were already stiff. The plight of families often could not bury their own, sometimes sick or too terrified. They relied on these strangers. A mother might watch helplessly as her child was taken away. A spouse might lose a partner in the dark hours, never seeing their face again. Mass graves and plague pit cities and towns opened vast pits, often outside city walls, for the dead bodies were stacked rapidly, sometimes burned, sometimes buried. These mass graves were unmarked, a stark contrast to traditional consecrated burials. Social stigma and the body collectors. The collectors were feared and shunned. Their work was vital but despised. They faced ostracism from neighbors and families. Yet, some found grim pride or acceptance within their grim profession. Psychological toll, their relentless exposure to death haunted these men. Reports speak of despair, madness, and exhaustion. Yet, their labor allowed cities to continue a morbid lifeline amid devastation. Historical accounts and legacy chroniclers wrote of body collectors with a mixture of fear, disgust, and sympathy. Their presence marked the darkest nights of the plague. They symbolize the hidden costs of survival. As the carts rattled through deserted streets under moonlight, the body collectors moved unseen, silent witnesses to a city dying and the fragile persistence of life among the dead. Chapter 10. Faith and Fear. Religion's role during the plague. In the shadow of death, faith became both refuge and torment. The Black Death tore through bodies, but it also shattered souls. Religion offered answers, rituals, and hope. Yet it also fueled fear, superstition, and sometimes cruelty. For medieval Europe, the plague was not just a medical catastrophe. It was a profound spiritual crisis. The Church's authority and response to the Catholic Church was the central institution of medieval life, shaping morals, laws, and daily rituals. When the plague arrived, the clergy faced an overwhelming task, tending the sick, burying the dead, and trying to interpret the catastrophe. Church leaders preached that the plague was God's punishment for human sins. A call to repentance, public penitence, and processions in many cities. Public processions and flagellant movements spread. Groups of penitents marched through streets, whipping themselves to atone for communal sins. These rituals sought to appease divine wrath. They drew huge crowds, but also sometimes spread disease further. The clergy's sacrifice and flight. Some priests remained to minister to the sick and dying, risking infection and death. Others fled their posts, leaving communities spiritually abandoned. This disparity shook faith and trust in religious authority. Prayers, saints, and relics. People turned to saints believed to have protective power. Pilgrimages increased as the faithful sought miracles. Relics of saints were carried through towns in processions. Prayers and masses were offered to stave off death, blame, and scapegoating in the name of faith. Religion also fueled darker impulses. Jewish communities were scapegoated and persecuted, accused falsely of poisoning wells. Witch hunts intensified. The fear of divine punishment led to social fractures and violence. The rise of new religious movements. The plague accelerated religious change. Some sought reform, criticizing the Church's failure. Mystical movements and sects gained followers. Seeds of later upheavals were sown amid the crisis. Consolation and crisis for many. Religion was a source of comfort, a way to understand suffering and death. For others, it was a cause of despair. Medieval art and literature reflect this complex relationship. The dance of death, for example, a reminder of mortality and the equality of all before God. The lasting spiritual legacy. The Black Death reshaped medieval spirituality. It altered views on life, death, and the afterlife. It challenged institutions and inspired new forms of faith. In the flickering candlelight of plague-ridden churches, the prayers, cries, and silence spoke of humanity's deepest fears and its stubborn hope. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. How Europe changed after the plague. Black Death did not simply fade away once the last victims had been buried. Its shadow stretched across centuries, permanently altering the very foundations of European society. The plague was a crucible of destruction, but also a catalyst for profound transformation. To truly grasp the scope of this change, we must examine the demographic, economic, social, cultural, and psychological upheavals that followed the pandemic's deadly sweep. The demographic catastrophe, death and desolation. No measure can fully capture the scale of human loss. Between 1347 and 1353, the plague wiped out an estimated 30% to 60% of Europe's population. Some regions suffered even more devastating blows, with entire towns and villages erased from the map. The countryside bore the brunt. Communities once vibrant were abandoned, fields left fallow, and houses stood empty, slowly swallowed by nature. In cities like Florence and London, death tolls reached staggering heights, overwhelming hospitals and churches alike. This demographic collapse created a vacuum, a silence where bustling life once thrived. The survivors found themselves in a world of sudden scarcity, fewer hands to farm the land, fewer mouths to trade with, fewer voices to share customs and traditions. Economic upheaval, from scarcity to opportunity, drastic reduction in population triggered a seismic shift. In economic structures, with so many laborers dead, the survivors found themselves in high demand. Landowners who had long relied on serfdom suddenly had to compete for workers. In many regions, peasants found they could demand higher wages or better living conditions. This marked one of the first significant challenges to the entrenched feudal system. Wages increased dramatically. Some peasants and laborers moved from rural manors to burgeoning towns, seeking better opportunities. This migration fueled urban growth in certain areas. Despite the plague's initial devastation, craft guilds struggled to maintain their ranks. Master artisans died without apprentices to replace them. Some guilds relaxed entry restrictions, allowing more workers in, which gradually eroded their monopolies. Urban decline and rebirth. Cities in transition. Many medieval cities were devastated by plague deaths, but this destruction paradoxically set the stage for urban transformation. Trade networks initially collapsed as fear and death closed borders and ports. Markets and fairs were abandoned. Merchants lost capital and goods, yet survivors inherited property, wealth, and social roles. In places like Venice and Paris, the reduced population allowed for redistribution of property and rise of a new middle-class dot. The demographic shock accelerated the shift from medieval town structures toward more modern economic hubs. Urban planners and authorities began to rethink city layouts and sanitation. Early attempts at public health reforms arose to curb future outbreaks. Social upheaval, power, revolt, and reform. The old social order quaked under the strain of the plague. Nobles found their power challenged as peasants and laborers leveraged their newfound scarcity. Peasant revolts exploded in several regions, including the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and similar uprisings in France and Germany. These revolts were fueled by a mix of economic grievances, harsh taxation, and frustration at rigid social hierarchies. Though many revolts were brutally suppressed, they signaled a shift. The medieval class system was no longer immutable. The decline of feudalism and the rise of new social orders, the Black Death, accelerated the slow collapse of feudalism. The manorial system depended on a surplus of serfs tied to the land. When labor became scarce and costly, many landowners lost the ability to enforce servitude. This erosion gave way to new economic relationships, tenant farming, wage labor, and early capitalist ventures. The seeds of a more flexible market society took root amid the ashes of the old. Public health, foundations of modern sanitation, scale of death forced cities and towns to confront public health on an unprecedented scale. Quarantine measures became codified, and authorities established permanent facilities to isolate the sick. Sanitation laws began to regulate waste disposal, and street cleaning practices unheard of before the plague. This new focus on communal health laid early foundations for modern urban planning and epidemiology, agricultural innovation, and environmental change. With fewer hands to work the land, farmers innovated dot shifts from labor-intensive, grain cultivation to pasture and sheep farming became widespread. This pivot fueled the wool industry, a cornerstone of medieval and early modern European economy. Large landowners consolidated holdings, often enclosing common lands, which sowed seeds of future conflicts but also modern property concepts. Cultural and religious aftershocks, the plague shook faith in God and the church. But it also deepened religious devotion in many. The failure of the clergy to protect communities or explain the plague led some to question established religious authority. Mystical movements, flagellants, and new sects grew in popularity. At the same time, art and literature began to reflect new themes of death and impermanence. The Danse Macabre, dance of death, became a pervasive motif, reminding all social classes of mortality's inevitability. Intellectual and scientific ramifications, the Black Death's upheaval spurred curiosity and inquiry. Though true scientific understanding of disease would take centuries, plague chronicles recorded symptoms, spread patterns, and treatments. Universities adjusted curricula, and medical schools gained prominence. These developments were subtle, but important precursors to the Renaissance and later scientific revolutions. Demographic recovery, a long Rhodrop's population took over a century to recover to pre-plague levels. Each generation bore the imprint of loss. The resulting social and economic transformations shaped the trajectory of European history for centuries. The psychological scars of the plague survivors struggled with trauma, grief, and survivors' guilt. Communities mourned. Generations of family members lost. This collective trauma influenced cultural expressions. From somber religious ceremonies to the somber tones of medieval art and literature, a new Europe emerges. The Black Death stands as a watershed, the end of the medieval world and the dawn of modern Europe. Its aftermath was not merely survival, but transformation, a rebirth forged in loss. As the dust settled on a changed continent, the echoes of the plague would resonate in every field, street, and heart, forever altering Europe's destiny. Conclusion: reflections on life during the Black Deaths. We reach the end of this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. It's impossible not to feel the weight of the Black Death, not just as a catastrophic event, but as a profound human experience that forever altered the course of life in medieval Europe. The plague was more than a disease. It was a brutal force that upended everything people once knew: their families, communities, beliefs, economies, and hopes for the future. It tore through cities and villages with merciless speed, leaving death, despair, and silence in its wake. Yet amid the suffering, life persisted. The survivors endured, adapted, and reshaped their world in ways that still echo today. The human experience, fear, loss, and resilience. Imagine living in a world where the familiar rhythms of daily life, work, worship, celebration were shattered by a silent enemy that could strike without warning. Fear was constant. The sight of neighbors falling ill, the knowledge that death might visit your own doorstep tomorrow, haunted every moment. Families were torn apart, often unable to bury their loved ones or find comfort in rituals that once provided solace. Entire communities vanished, replaced by eerie emptiness. Yet, within this darkness, resilience shone through. From the noble castles to the humble cottages, people sought ways to protect themselves, isolating, fleeing, praying, and sometimes fighting. Those who cared for the sick, like the plague doctors and clergy, risked everything to offer compassion, even when many others turned away. The complexity of society under siege, the plague exposed stark inequalities, but also blurred social lines. The wealthy might attempt to isolate themselves behind castle walls, but no amount of gold could guarantee safety. Conversely, the poorest suffered not only from disease, but from fear, hunger, and violence. Social structures were strained. Some broke, others transformed. The labor shortages empowered peasants and workers in unprecedented ways, while traditional institutions, from the church to feudal lords, faced crises of authority. The Black Death forced a reckoning. Societies had to confront old systems and adapt or collapse. Faith-tested and transformed religion was both a refuge and a source of fear. For many, the plague was divine punishment, demanding repentance and humility. Processions, prayers, and rituals filled the streets as people sought answers and comfort. But the failure to halt the disease, combined with clergy who sometimes fled or were overwhelmed, shook the foundations of faith. This spiritual crisis would sow seeds of reform and new, religious movements in the centuries ahead. Nature's role and the unseen enemy, the plague, was also a lesson in the complex relationships between humans and the natural world. Rats, fleas, and other animals, often ignored or feared, played a critical role in spreading the disease. Medieval understandings were limited, and this ignorance shaped the panic and scapegoating that followed. The massacre of cats and dogs, driven by superstition, ironically worsened the situation, revealing how fear can distort reason. A catalyst for change, the Black Death was a turning point. Economically, the labor shortages disrupted centuries-old feudal systems, accelerating social mobility and new economic models. Culturally, it inspired art and literature, reflecting mortality and the fragility of life. Politically, it weakened some authorities and empowered others, reshaping governance. Scientifically, it motivated inquiry into medicine and public health early. Steps toward modern understanding. The legacy in our modern world, though the plague happened over 6 centuries ago, its legacy lingers. Public health practices, quarantine measures, and epidemiology trace roots back to this crisis. The societal transformations set the stage for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern era, and perhaps most importantly, the Black Death reminds us of human vulnerability, but also of human resilience and adaptability in the face of catastrophe. Final thoughts. History often seems distant, but the story of the Black Death is deeply human. It's about people who faced unimaginable suffering and loss. It's about fear, hope, despair, and endurance. By understanding what life was really like during the plague, we honor those who lived through it, not as mere statistics or distant figures, but as individuals whose lives shaped the world we inhabit today. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of the past. May we carry forward the lessons of resilience, compassion, and wisdom, even in our own uncertain times.